Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome once again to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. As you are aware, these lectures are being recorded under the broad title of Cultural Studies. We are today in the last lecture of our second module, which has been devoted to key concepts in the field of cultural theory. And you will recall that we looked at a few key concepts like subjectivity, identity, ideology, power, representation, discourse and gender. On some occasions, we also devoted more than one lecture to a few topics, for instance, ideology, representation, and today we are in the second lecture devoted to the key concept gender. You will also recall that this module, which I said has been devoted to concepts. You will also recall that in the very beginning of this module, we said that concepts may be defined as ideas and which has a certain degree of abstractions. Concepts are tools, they are units of knowledge or of meaning. And as I said, a certain degree of abstraction or abstractness, if you will, is always desirable when we talk about concepts. Why? Because they would have to be applicable, okay, to different situations. Only when they are of a certain degree of abstractness can these be applied to understand or analyze certain cultural situations. So, what did we do in the last lecture? In the last lecture, I had said that in the first lecture on gender, I would be looking, or we would be talking about more or less a traditional way of how gender, sex, gender and sexuality have been studied in the humanities. And within that we saw that sex was seen as something biological, something to do with our reproductive functions and our reproductive activities. On the other hand, gender was seen to be something that tried to go beyond reductionist approaches. In this case, sex was seen as simply biological and hence reductionist, an effort to de-link the biological and the social and to argue for socio-political determinants. We also saw that patriarchy was seen as a political institution by critics writing in the 60s and 70s, like Kate Millett, for instance, in her well-known book Sexual Politics. Then we also saw that gender in cultural studies has to be related to other concepts like power, subjectivity, consumption, the formation of identities, certainly representation, popular culture, etc. Then we talked about masculinities, because usually it is seen that whenever we talk about gender, there is a tendency to talk about women, to talk about feminism. Okay? But we said that we would look at masculinities for a change, and we saw that some of the points that have been made by critics, for instance, R.W. Connell in Masculinities and Globalization talks about gender on a large scale, on a global scale, which is masculinities that are determined by the state, by international relations, international trade and global markets, etc., which forms a discourse of masculinity, which sees masculinity as based or as determined, or so to speak, whose foundation is that of reason, distance, independence and control, which in turn seem to give rise to certain tendencies like lack of emotional communication, sometimes veering towards self-destruction through addiction, violence, etc. So, let me quickly refer to the key source texts, some of the key source texts that we will be using in the current lecture on gender, and these are Critical and Cultural Theory by Danny Cavallaro. This lecture is on certain developments in the field of gender, okay, and which we today call post-feminist, and informed by a post-structuralist approach. There are several critics here that several writers, several theorists we could bring to bear upon our discussion, but owing to certain limitations, that this is only we are going to talk about this only through one lecture. I have brought in Judith Butler, who is today reputed to be one of the best proponents, or she is an exemplar of this kind of theorizing about gender. So, at least two of her books, Gender Trouble and Bodies That Matter, and a few insights given by Sarah Sally and Angela McRobbie. So, I would also of course refer to quickly to Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. Well, as you know, we have been now looking at gender through a post-enlightenment, if you look at the slide here, post-enlightenment approach. The enlightenment, which happened in Europe following the growth of science and the growth of technology, gave us, as we know, and when we did our lectures on some of the theoretical schools like structuralism, etc., Marxism, gave us what the critics of enlightenment thought called grand narratives. Okay? Grand narratives like Marxism, grand narratives like science or religion, which gave us which saw or gave us knowledge based among other things on certain binaries. Okay? Now, post enlightenment thinking, which is essentially which essentially boils down to post structuralism, to postmodernism, seeks to sort of see through these boundaries. Okay? Post enlightenment thinking, particularly beginning with Nietzsche and then followed by by Michel Foucault, Derrida, etc., breaks these binaries. For instance, the sex slash gender binary, which is the, you could say, the bedrock of traditional feminism, talking about women, women's rights and differentiating between sex and gender, is here problematized by critics like Judith Butler. And the rise of queer studies, if you look at this slide here, the rise of queer studies, which looks at the history of cultural representation of marginalized groups which do not follow any normative sexuality, which do not follow any normative way of life. Okay? So, this problematization that I was talking about, and let me quickly read from this slide. There is a problematization, as I had said before, of the sex gender dichotomy, okay, where sex was seen as biological and gender was seen as social. Okay. Under this very dichotomy, and we shall see how it has been problematized or this binary rendered untenable, okay, in today's world. Second, the importance of representation in sexual identity. Then discussion on discourse and gender, where it is held quite radically that biological truths are not given truths. Biological truths, the description of sex, the description of the first part of the binary, which was many thought was reductionist, which reduce itself to the body, to biology, is seen in this new wave of gender studies as something that you can access only through discourse, something that is constructed through language. This of course leads many to sort of prematurely jump to jump to a conclusion or jump to a counter argument that how can sex be just a linguistic construct. They are not denying the reality of the biological body, but the description of sex vis-a-vis gender, the description is not something that you can access without discourse. That is the point being made here. It is not to deny the materiality or the presence of the body. Number 4, this problematization entails also the function of regulatory ways of speaking in the formation and determination of sex bodies. Now, this is related to point number 3, in the sense that the point number 3 says that biological truths are accessed through discourse. Number 4 says that even this discursive accessing of biological truths are done in regulatory ways. The way you can talk about these biological truths are also monitored and determined. So, the talking about sexed bodies, whether male, whether female, or of any kind of sex body, is also controlled by discourse. So, these are some of the ways in which theorists like Butler, in their very famous works like Gender Trouble, have brought to our notice. This is what Butler says. According to Butler, gender is not our only identity. This is extremely important. We are known so often, it is also often the socio-cultural practice, also sometimes the linguistic practice of first identifying somebody only in terms of whether they are male or female, only in terms of their behaviors as masculine or feminine, or as maybe what they call as being the behavior of tomboys or tomgirls, if you will. So, she says that gender is certainly not our only identity. We are partakers of different kinds of domains, and we both, as she says, we both belong to and not belong to particular discourses. So, that no discourse has we have to understand that no discourse actually has actually has full control over us. So, this very undecidedness or even undecidability of who we are, of our identities, you will recognize as a definite post-structuralist move, where even sex and gender are problematized, and where we say that we do not belong to we are not partakers of their discourses all the time. There are many different aspects to us, in which gender is not such an important variable. Second, a very important statement, she says here, gender is always a failure. Note this, gender is always a failure, an accumulated fact of social relations that have become naturalized. Look at this word, naturalized over time. How is gender a failure? Gender is a failure because we, as this is related to the first point, we are over and above the discourses of gender. So, it is not that gender is played out by us all the time under all situations, and it is only a fact in that it is made by social relations, and it is a fact which is not a given, but has been, as she says, naturalized over time. Then in the next slide, she also calls gender not simply a failure, not something that is I mean forcibly, so to speak, naturalized. She also refers to what is called the illusion of gender, and I am reading from Butler. The effect of gender must be understood as the mundane ways in which bodily gestures, movements and styles of various kind constitute the illusion of an abiding gender self. So, if according to Butler, if one thinks that one has a gender self which is forever, okay, which is an abiding one, which is a lasting one, she says that one is perhaps terribly mistaken. Okay. There is what she calls these habits of behavior, she calls the bodily gestures, the movements and styles of various kinds is only an illusion of gender that we have. And secondly, the important point here is this way of thinking is a critique of what we call traditional feminism. Next, she also says that the working out of one's sexual identity is actually fraught with anxiety. This is the word she uses, okay, on sexual anxiety. She says that sexuality is to be a certain, or to be a certain gender need not mean possessing a certain sexuality. It may even mean non-sexuality. Okay. We always try, we always look at behaviors as, many markers, whether it be of dress or ways of walking or ways of talking, gestures by, you made by your hands, etc. We are always looking, at them as markers of a certain kind of sexuality. But Butler says, there is no, there is, so to speak, there is no benchmark of, sexuality. There are many, in fact, many sexualities. Okay. It is only, femininity as is represented perhaps by, by certain markers in, for instance, in popular culture, in films, in television, in glossy magazines, for instance, okay, which create the illusion of a sort of benchmark of femininity or also of masculinity. But she says, well, there is no, it is only an illusion that is created by representation, and she also adds this important point that it may even mean non-sexuality. Okay. So, the markers that we have may be something that is read by people since they are culturally trained, but it may also sometimes mean or suggest the possibility of non-sexuality. Next, she says that the anxiety about gender as identity and practice is created by regulatory practices. Now, but because we live in a culture, because we live in certain discourses, because we live in so many, in a in surroundings or in an environment where there are so many cultural objects, so many things that sort of, remember Althusser says beckoning or interpellating, calling us to our, hey, this is the way you should look like, or this is the ultimate femininity thing to do if you want to be feminine. Okay. So, she says that there is always an anxiety in people, okay, to sort of not just simply to live up to those benchmarks or normative markers, but also how to grapple, how far to to actually spend one's energies, how often to try and meet, so to speak, those standards. So, there is anxiety about gender as identity, since it is created by certain regulatory practices of how you ought to look or behave in a, if you are in a certain, if you want to be identified as belonging to a certain gender. Then she says there is a fear of loss of identity, of no longer, as she says, of no longer belonging to an accepted sexuality. Okay. So, both anxiety and there is also fear of, say, the loss of one's sexuality. If you are not going by those markers, you may be called say a manly woman or a womanly man. So, there is always, because of these regulatory practices, because of these standards, so to speak, which are actually illusions that have been set in society by regulatory practices. Gender is a difficult term. It is a difficult business, okay, in keeping up with those markers. Then she, we learn that there are multiple modes of femininity and masculinity. There is no one way of being feminine or masculine. There are multiple modes which are potentially enactable. Okay, we may not enact them for fear of, as she says, or for anxiety or for fear of losing one's gender identity. Nevertheless, it does not do away with the important fact that there are potentially many ways in which gender may be enacted, okay? Each of which is, so to speak, a legitimate one in its own right. Therefore, sex and gender are malleable, sex and gender are changeable, sex and gender are fluid. Okay? So, you see here the shift from talking about gender as fluid and sex as a given, as fixed, to both as being malleable, changeable, fluid and not a given. Okay? This is a very important shift in the post-feminist and queer movement. Cavallaro comments on Butler's work in this way, and I am reading straight from his book Critical and Cultural Theory. Cavallaro's opinion is this: Butler argues that gender is performative. This is perhaps one of the most important words in post-feminism, particularly as propounded by Judith Butler, which she says that gender is not a given, all right, but we also have to understand it much further by looking at gender as performative. This, I think, if you have to zoom in on one word, which is one of her most important contributions in this field, that this word is that of performativity. Judith Butler, Cavallaro here, Judith Butler argues that gender is performative. This implies that a person's gendered identity is produced through performance and role playing. Okay? This is not, so we would say that this is non-ontological, right? It is performance, and as it says next here, the word repetition. Okay? Performance being repeated several times that instantiates that behavior as masculine or feminine. So, Cavallaro again, repetition plays a vital part in this process, for it is by performing certain acts repeatedly that the individual acquires an apparently coherent identity. Look at the word here, apparent. Okay? The individual by repeating accepted or acceptable or desired gendered practices with their relevant markers, okay, begins to believe that he or she has a stable, a coherent gendered identity. On the other hand, the reality is that it is only because of these repetition or reiteration of certain performances or as gendered performances that we have this illusion of a coherent, stable gendered self and gendered behavior. So, repetition plays a vital part in this process, for it is by performing certain acts repeatedly that the individual acquires an apparently coherent identity. Repetition, moreover, is dictated by what a particular culture, this is what we have already talked about, repetition of what, if you ask repetition of what, and just a while ago I had said that what is desired, right, what is expected. So, repetition is dictated by what a particular culture expects of its members, by dominant ideologies and by ways of organizing sexual behavior. Okay? So, gender performativity hinges, and this is another important word, on reiterative practice of regular sexual regimes. So, it looks like we all sort of have this interpellation by ideology, by dominant ways of organizing sexual behavior, that this is how a particular gendered behavior should finally arrive at. Therefore, to summarize this quickly, according to Butler, gender is performative, that is, it is non-ontological. Okay? It is a matter of performance and role playing, okay, which is instantiated by repetition and reiteration by what? By the ideologies of sexual regimes. Now, I am quoting straight from Butler. I think this is from her book Gender Trouble. The category of sex is from the start normative. Normative in the sense of laying down certain rules or norms of behavior. Normative also in the sense of normal. What is normal is always prescribed, something that is not something that does not fall from the heavens. Okay? These are codes that are normalized by repeated use and by the dominant ideologies. Now, she brings in Foucault here. The category of sex is from the start normative. It is what Foucault has called a regulatory ideal. This is an ideal that is to be reached, okay, through certain regulations. Okay. This is the ideal way of say behavior or having markers, etc., of behavior. In this sense then, sex not only functions as a norm, but is part of a regulatory practice that produces the bodies it governs. Now, this is very important. Okay. This is how the body is produced. Okay. Sex not only functions as a norm, but is part of a practice that produces the bodies. This is where the post-structuralist element in looking at sex also as socially constructed comes in. It seems to, when you first look at it, seems to, because you are so attuned to the traditional way of looking at the binary of sex versus gender, okay, that it at first is difficult to accept it. But you begin to understand that these are the ideologies, the regulatory practices that the bodies are produced by it. Again, let me reiterate, it is not that we do not have the kind of bodies that we have, the kind of gendered bodies that we have, but the bodies also are produced by dominant discourses. Okay, this is when you write about bodies, when you talk about bodies, it is through language and it is through discourse. This is a very valuable contribution of post-feminism. That is those regulatory force, whose regulatory force is made clear as a kind of productive power. The power to do what? The power to produce, demarcate, circulate, differentiate the bodies it controls. More about this will be, we will have to unpack this a bit as we go on. Thus, sex is a regulatory ideal whose materialization is compelled through certain highly regulated practices. Okay? In other words, sex therefore is an ideal construct, a construct of the discourses of regulatory practices that tell you that there is a there is, as Foucault says, a regulatory ideal to be achieved. So, again in Bodies That Matter, okay, Butler writes, now this is I am quoting from Bodies That Matter. I began writing this book by trying to consider the materiality of the body, only to find that the thought of materiality invariably moved me into other domains. Okay. So, bodies that matter. Now, matter, of course, you can understand that there is a play on matter, matter as bodies that are important, as bodies that matter, something that matters, and also materiality. Okay. So, there is a play in on the word term matter here. So, she says that while trying to explore the body and its materiality, okay, the body as a material form, she says that while exploring it, I found that this led me to many other domains, so much so that, let us look at the next sentence that she says here, I tried to discipline myself to stay on the subject, but I found that I could not fix bodies as simple objects of thought. So, there is a realization obviously here that one could not speak even of the materiality of the body without running into problems. Okay? Without there is no simple way of talking about bodies, even as material entities. Bodies therefore move beyond these boundaries of biology. This is the first point. Okay? That is why there is a need to question those very boundaries that bound, so to speak, bound one discourse off from another. Okay? That bracket off one discourse from another. Okay? Now, again look at the look at the topic of the body of the sexed body, then we find that we have to move to question the very boundaries of what it means to be not masculine feminine gender, but also what it means to be male and female from a biological point of view. And therefore, as she says, there has to be a resistance to the fixing of the subject, okay, the fixing of the gendered and the sexed subject. Now, therefore, by now you I am sure have realized that there is a definite shift from Simone de Beauvoir to Judith Butler, but Butler in her book Gender Trouble acknowledges the indebtedness to Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. If you remember the famous quotation, one is not born but becomes a woman, which by Simone de Beauvoir, and this she furthers she gives a twist to the term becoming. So, she says that yes, one is not born a woman, but becomes one, which is Beauvoir's terms, but she sees becoming as not an end. Okay? She sees in a typical post-structuralist way, she says the process of becoming a woman. So, in this case even man, okay, as one that is endless, or you could even say in Derridian terms, one that is endlessly deferred. So, you never reach the full meaning of being a man or a woman, you never reach the full potential of being, so to speak, masculine or feminine. Why? Because the construction of masculinity and femininity, or even of male and female, are never givens, and they change from time to time, from epoch to epoch. Okay? And that is why she says a mode of becoming male or female, or masculine or feminine, that has no end. To be a woman is a mode of becoming that does not ever end. It is applicable to all gendered orientations, not just man and woman. We talk about sexual ambiguity here, when one does not want to arrive at a proper identification of oneself as either masculine or feminine. Ambiguity is very important here, and the ambiguous categories are also masculine, marginalized categories. And importantly, she says that this could lead to any number of directions. Okay? This becoming, she says, which is never an end or never reaches an end, which is an endless process, may lead to many directions. It is not just that one is going towards one ideal. The regulatory ideal is given to us, as Foucault says, by discourses, by regulatory practices, but in reality, as Butler says, okay, as this whole process of becoming may lead to different directions of sexual and gender practices altogether. This really is, as we have written here, this is the central thesis of her book Gender Trouble. Then I am reading this in relation to Beauvoir as given by Butler. If there is something right in Beauvoir's claim that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, it follows that woman itself is a term in process. Okay? Woman is a term in process, a becoming, a constructing that cannot rightfully be said to originate or to end. As an ongoing discursive practice, it is open to intervention and resignification. This is most important. You see how she uses Beauvoir's words and how she moves beyond it, okay, in her insistence on the fact that we can, it is a process that has no end, and secondly that it is subject to to resignification, it is subject to intervention by people themselves, okay, in fashioning their own gendered practices. Therefore, to look at it as a diagram, our gendered subjectivities are always in process, and one does not know in real terms, one does not know where it leads us to. Therefore, sex, which we saw, okay, which we saw in our last lecture through traditional gender studies as something that is biological and reductionist, is through this turn, okay, what we can easily call the queer turn, the queering of gender studies. The queer turn in gender studies goes beyond biology and means regulatory ideals. Sex is normative, it is not just a reproductive power, it is also a productive power. Why? Because through discourse, through repetition, through reiteration, okay, sex is a productive power in discourse. It only through gives us an illusion, as we said, of stability, okay, of sexual stability, of biological stability only through discourse, and hence apart from being a reproductive power, it is also a productive power. Okay. Sex is also through regulatory practices made an ideal construct. Sex is stylization, okay, in the sense of both trying to keep up to a gendered ideal and just a while ago as we saw, both in trying to re-signify and to intervene in the the process of acceptance. Sex is a process, and sex is ultimately also a forcible reiteration. Okay. So, you see how this kind of thinking, this turn that gender studies has taken in cultural studies and in theory, you see how very different it is from the older binary way of looking as sex and gender as two different things, which say where sex has nothing to do with society. Okay. Next we come to an important word, a very interesting word, from girling. But Butler says that there is, in becoming a girl, there is a process of girling, and let us read from her. She says, consider the medical interpellation, again this medical hailing out, which shifts an infant from an it to a she or a he. The moment the baby is born, okay, there is obviously the first thing that one of the first things at least that would be hail the baby as a male or female and declare to the parents that whether it's a male or female or a boy or a girl. So, she says there is a process of girling. Okay, it shifts an infant from an it to a he or a she or a he, and in that naming the girl is girled. Okay. Look at the parallel here with Simone de Beauvoir's one is not born a woman, but becomes one. Okay. In that naming, the girl is girled, brought into the domain of language. Okay. This is a very clear working out of what she means by interpellation, by gender interpellation, by what she means by something which is considered reductionist as sex being part of discourse. So, naming the girl is girled, brought into the domain of language and kinship through the interpellation of gender. But that girling of the girl, she says, does not end there, does not end only in the hospital or in the birthing environment. On the contrary, that founding interpellation is reiterated by various authorities and throughout the various intervals of time to reinforce or contest this naturalized effect. The naming is at once the setting of a boundary and also the repeated inculcation of a norm. So, this whole process that she says of girling is it sets the boundary of girl, of girlhood, of girl behavior, girlish behavior, and in the also it is a repeated inculcation and instantiation of a norm. A scholar on Butler scholar, so to speak, Sarah Sally, hails this book Gender Trouble. Sorry, Gender Trouble should have been in italics. Gender Trouble makes trouble, she says. Okay, how does this book make trouble? She says Gender Trouble makes trouble by calling the category of the subject into question, by arguing that it is a performative construct. Okay, so the whole category of subject, we have talked about subjectivity of of being a subject. Okay, the process of becoming in the lecture on subjectivity, but she says how makes trouble in the sense of how the some accepted terms, terminology in fact is shaken by these reformulations by Judith Butler, by calling the category of the subject into question. Okay, and by showing, by working it out and showing that the subject is nothing but a performative construct. All that you thought was your inner life, okay, your inner choices, for instance, all these are actually the result of performance. Then gender trouble makes trouble in another way by asserting that there are ways of doing one's identity. Now, not just in the sense, not only in subject or subjectivity, in the category of identity now is also made kind of rendered into a trouble or rendered problematic. How? That identity, remember the distinction we made a very, of course, a very elementary distinction between subjectivity as inner and of identity as how society looks at you, where subjectivity is seen as one's inner life and identity is seen as how society looks at you. That was an elementary distinction. I am not saying that this without its problems. However, one easy way of looking at it is as identity as a social label. Gender trouble makes trouble, as she says, Sarah Sally says, by asserting that identity is doing. Identity is also a performance according to the regulatory practices. It is something we do, okay? Something we do, something we practice in a bid to approximate the regulatory ideals that are given to us by society. And then she says, please look at the slide, gender trouble will cause even further trouble for those who have a vested interest in preserving existing oppositions such as male, female, masculine, feminine, gay, straight or homosexual and heterosexual. She says that in future, and which is happening now, okay, more problematization would be done and people will have to rethink, okay, those, as she says, those who have a vested interest, those who have a political interest, okay, in maintaining the divide, in maintaining the distinction, very sharp distinctions between male, female or homosexual, heterosexual, etc., they are not going to be accepted so easily once this queering of gender is done, both in theory and in practice. So, we have a few very important questions therefore, that are raised by Judith Butler, and I would read these out. These are, I would say, enormously important. Okay. The first question that Butler asks is there a gender, is there a particular gender which persons are said to have, or is it an essential attribute that a person is said to be? Okay, that is gender something to be possessed, or is gender to be, is something to be or to exist in, as implied in the question, what gender are you? Why she is saying this here is because all this while she is already sort of argued very well that gender is a performance, gender is fluid, sex also is fluid, okay, because it is a matter of discourse, it is also a construction. So, she says, is there any point in asking what gender are you? Since remember she had said that gender is malleable, gender is changeable, okay, and the word, that phrase, potentially enactable. So, is there any point in asking a question like this, what gender are you, when there are potentially so many ways in which gender may be acted out, okay, when where we dismiss the idea of an ideal to be achieved. Okay. And remember what she says, it can take you to different directions or in different directions. Okay. Question number 2. When feminist theorists, these are extremely sharp penetrating questions that Butler is giving us in her bid to create trouble, gender trouble. When feminist theorists claim that gender is the cultural interpretation of sex, or that gender is culturally constructed vis-a-vis sex, what is the manner or mechanism of this construction? How do you say that this has been done? Okay. So, she is asking, there is a need to work this out, there is a need to talk about how this very mechanism of thinking of gender as only as culturally constructed has been worked out. Question number 3, if gender is constructed, could it be constructed differently, or does its constructedness imply some form of social determinism, foreclosing the possibility of agency and transformation? Okay. So, is there a way in which all these hitherto ways of constructing gender and showing gender as a cultural construct, is it possible for us to construct them differently and therefore create gender trouble? Number 4, does construction suggest that certain laws generate sexual differences along universal axes of sexual difference? Can we claim that there is a universal axis, or there are several axes along which gender difference can be categorically marked out and constructed? And the last 2, how and where does the construction of gender take place? And what sense can we make of a construction that cannot assume a human constructor prior to that construction? Okay. How can we make any sense of such a construction when we do not have a human constructor prior to that construction, meaning the construction itself, the process itself is the product in this case. So, we will now come to quickly look at what are the keywords that we use. The keywords that we use in this lecture were post-feminism, queer, performativity, performance, reiteration, illusion, instability, regulation, etc. So, we will just look at 1 or 2 questions. For instance, what is entailed in the move from traditional feminism to post-feminism? There is a problematization here in the sex-gender dichotomy, and it focuses on the importance of representation in sexual identity and biological truths. The biological truths are accessed through discourse, and they are not givens, and there are the regulatory ways of speaking in the formation of sex bodies. Second, how do theorists like Judith Butler consider the body as problematic? The body is problematic because there is a need to move beyond boundaries, and we have to question the boundaries of materiality, immateriality, language, and abstract things like language and tangible things. These are the binaries in a very post-structuralist way that we have to deconstruct. Okay, and there has to be a resistance to the fixing of the body and the labeling of bodies. Finally, summarize the formulation of reformulation of gender as a category as argued by Butler. In post-feminism, we find that gender is relative and contextual. It is, to summarize this lecture also in a way, it is a shifting phenomenon, non-substantive, the relative point of convergence among culturally and historically specific sets of relations. There is the totality is an illusion which is permanently deferred, it's an endless process where one never arrives at a certain gender, and we also see it as open coalition, okay, an open assemblage. Okay. So, there is you could say a fashioning, right, a fashioning of refashioning, self-fashioning of gender that you can do or one can do without without trying to achieve or without trying to reach a certain ideal of gender, which is nothing but an ideal that has been set up by what Butler and the rest call regulatory practices. Okay, after Foucault, regulatory practices that are determined by power in society. Thank you, and in the next lecture we shall be beginning the next module, the third module, wherein you also have about 9 to 10 lectures, okay, on sites, okay, SITES, on sites where culture happens, right. So, see you next time, and thank you.